Greetings, good people. Welcome to Who Knows Is Just Life, the podcast. This is your host, Kyle. Before we get into this episode, I want to mention that it features Stina Hamlin, Barrie Adleberg, and Vicki Ramirez. At the time of this recording, they were involved with Red House series. Since the recording of this episode, it came to light that the non-native founder and leader of Red House series was really not in line with the goals and values that they thought she was at the time, and so they are no longer affiliated with Red House series. The contents and thoughts expressed by Vicki, Stina, and Barrie are absolutely still valuable. I just want to make sure that it's clear that the Red House series is not an organization that we would support at this time. I've removed any references to the organization and their sites at the end of the episode, so please forgive me for the editing towards the end there. As always, thank you for listening. Enjoy the show. Greetings, good people. Welcome to Who Knows It's Just Life, the podcast. I'm your host, Kyle. Thank you for listening. On today's episode, I have some very special guests from the Red House series. Joining me are Stina Hamlin, Vickie Ramirez, and Barrie Adleberg. Their work focuses on the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and trans women, and the related issues of climate change and fossil fuel extraction. They're working on several projects, including a podcast called Not Invisible, Native Women on the Front Lines. Today, we'll be exploring the concept of reframing Thanksgiving. But before we get into that, welcome to the show, everybody. Thank you for joining me. Could you please each introduce yourselves?
Chwent Eskanahe, Yafa Vicki Ramirez. Hello, how's it going? I'm Vicki Ramirez. I am a playwright and a writer. I am part of the team on the Not Invisible podcast and Red House series. Thank you so much for inviting us to speak today. Nyawai.
Hi, I'm Stina Hamlin. I'm a mom. I'm Cherokee, Choctaw, and Irish. I'm from Texas. I live in New York City. I'm a creator. I love technology, so I've been working in film and TV for a very long time. And now I ended up in post-production, so that's kind of where I'm working now. And I'm a producer for Red House series. And we've just been coming together to really promote this television series that we want to get on the air.
My name is Barrie Adleberg. I live and work in Lenapehoking, otherwise known as New York City. You and I know each other from the University of Maryland, though, from a group called Community Roots. So for those listeners who don't know what Community Roots is, it was a group of students that came together in a shared recognition of the way that their communities were segregated and segmented that inhibited these conversations. And so we brought people together, and it started off small to have those hard conversations, which then really led to this critical mass of people who were interested in digging below the surface of what was going on in the world around them. And that led to political action. So I am so proud of everyone that came out of that group, and we've all done really powerful things in life. And I'm so happy that you brought us together today. I am currently a producer and narrative designer.
And I also do it with a team that's here today. So Stina and Vicki and Renzo and Jen and Shay and Tanis and Ashley, we all work on this project called Red House.
Thank you so much for mentioning that, Barrie. That Sea Roots connection is how this conversation came to be. Barrie mentioned the work she was doing at Red House in our Sea Roots group chat, and here we are today as a result of that. Thank you very much for that, and I owe you the thanks for joining me on this podcast.
We're a team. We're making stuff happen, but I'm excited to be here and so grateful that you listen to our podcast and have and hopefully you've learned stuff and been inspired as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I've learned a lot. It's definitely an inspiring podcast. The production quality is great too, which I can appreciate. And yeah, I definitely want to keep hearing more of what you all are working on. In fact, one part of the podcast that I appreciate specifically is that when you introduce yourselves, you introduce the land that you're on with respect to the Native nation who was there historically, and then you bring it to the current name that the settler colonial society gives it. And so that inspired me to do the same for where I'm from, which is, so I'm from Maryland, and it was frustrating, frankly, at how difficult it was to try to get a good sense of, what Native nations were here in this area. But so I and actually Barrie helped me with this, but eventually I basically figured out that the Piscataway Nacotchtank peoples were here kind of right around what's today called the Anacostia River when John Smith and the Pilgrims were arriving here. And Anacostia is actually a long bastardization of the Nacotchtank, which to me is just absurd. So I do want to reiterate the premise of the show. It's called Who Knows It's Just Life. And by saying that, I'm admitting that I don't know and that I'm still learning. I'm moving in this world based on my own experiences and understandings to this point, but ultimately I'm constantly learning and trying to figure out things as the world is coming to me and as I come to the world. So this podcast is basically a public expression of that learning process, and any and all topics are fair game. So I invite you to this space, and I welcome you to challenge me and check me if I say something that's not consistent with your experiences, because I'm open to that learning. And ultimately, I'm humbled that you all are willing to come on this podcast and share this discussion with me. I really do appreciate you welcoming me into your space in terms of this intimate conversation that's taking place about Thanksgiving and what this means from a Native perspective. All right, so one of the main thinking exercises that we talked about doing for this episode is the whole concept of Thanksgiving. And, anybody who's done a lick of history research knows that Thanksgiving has a problematic and controversial history. How do you see Thanksgiving, and how is this conversation manifesting within Red House?
For us, when I say us, I'm speaking specifically about my nation, like with the Tuscarora, which is, as you know, part of the Haudenosaunee. But with us and a lot of Native nations, we all have always celebrated the harvest ceremony. And that has always been part of our culture, celebrating a good harvest. And many cultures around the world, And I mean, that is something that happens with us every year as well. But as far as Thanksgiving to us is a lifestyle. It's very much a way of living. It's not a specific day in the calendar. It's and that's why I resist the idea when I see, and I understand completely when other nations say Thanksgiving is a invention of the settler culture to it's an amalgam of these things. And it is a time when there were a lot of things that happened on days where Thanksgiving celebrations celebrated that they massacred a bunch of Native people. But ultimately, when you go back down to it, with my nation, absolutely. The act of Thanksgiving is a lifestyle. You wake up every morning and you are grateful. You are grateful to the sun, to the air, to having good, fresh water to drink, having good food in your fridge. You're grateful for your family, for your company, for your health. You're grateful for the land you're standing on at the time. You don't have to own it, just grateful for that moment standing there. Great. And for me, I'm forever grateful for the East River. I go down to Gantry Park all the time because it settles my mind. It settles my spirit. And that is daily. That's not a day. It's daily. You live in gratitude. Start with gratitude. And it's much easier to deal with your day in our city, especially New York City, stress capital of the world. But it's much easier to start your day when you start in gratitude, when you start in that place of acceptance and happiness. And I know everybody's saying, oh, don't worry, be happy. And no, it's just acceptance and gratitude of the things that are available to you at the time. And this is like very deep in our culture. We have a Thanksgiving prayer that is said, for ceremonial occasions, but it's also said for great, like they've said it at the UN when a coming together of nations, because there is gratitude for that moment, for having that moment, for people taking the time to come together. And that has been in our tradition, by the way, well before the invention of the Thanksgiving holiday. Like for the I don't know if anybody knows, but the Haudenosaunee have been around as a confederacy for at least 1,000 years, is what we've tracked. At least 1,000 years here on the East Coast. And this is how we've existed. And so for me, Thanksgiving, I'm ambivalent about the date, but I appreciate the sentiment, even though I know it's corrupted as well. Like there's a lot of corruption attached to it. And I do feel we need to have those conversations and expose some of the darkness that is connected with it. But we should also have those moments with your family, have those moments with the people you care about, where you come together. The thing that ties it together with food, especially for me as well, connects because food is so much identity. You smell something and it takes you right to a certain circumstance, to a certain moment in your life. And it's that connection that we all share. And even if you're unfamiliar with the food, sharing it with people, sharing that experience connects you to each other. And I would like to see us take the opportunity of connecting with each other like that, find a way. But the way to do it is to go forward, is to find those commonalities, but also acknowledge the things that have happened. Like we need to acknowledge all the corruption that has happened in the name of Thanksgiving, and the lies and the false mythologies. Let's wipe them away and we can restart. There's room for everybody at the table if everybody comes with a good mind and a good heart. There's room for everybody, I mean, that's Haudenosaunee way. It's like everybody chips in, everybody does a little bit, but everybody eats,
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. It's just interesting to hear the conflict that is present, because gratitude is such an inherent part of your culture. The way that Thanksgiving is taught, it's almost a slap in the face to that, because it's a whitewashed version of it, and it's taught in a problematic way. There's still something positive we can grasp from it being what it is. Stina, what's your perspective on this?
It's a very interesting conversation. For me, I am in my search just for my own, my own culture, and reconnecting with my own culture. And just in the spirit of, yes, like we're always learning all the time. And I definitely am not speaking for all Native people, and all Native people are so different, from different tribes, areas. They've had different traumas. If you live on the reservation or if you're in the urban setting, like all of our lives are so different. But we obviously have, like a common, struggle, but it's just very, 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 very layered and complicated, and intertwined with, different settler colonialism tactics, and, tribal governments, and just, it's like so complicated. But for me, I guess, in my own journey to also just kind of like unlearn these lies, and also in protecting and wanting to build and raise our kids in truth and in love for the earth and respect for the planet and all of, living things and water. Thanksgiving is all basically just so, surrounded by capitalism. So there's so much like relearning, unlearning, remembering, like all of these concepts of like, or reclaiming, right? Reclaiming that was like taken from us. My belief right now is that just me right now in 2020, being a 47-year-old person. And after lots and lots and lots of struggle and like personal persistence and just cannot stop trying to make sure that my kids know that they know our culture. But then I think right now there's just a shift. I feel like there's a big shift in our communities just to look to the future. And we're trying to look at things on a positive, like what does an Indigenous, future look like? I'm a future ancestor. What do I want to be remembered, for? Or what do I want to make sure that my family and the blood memory that travels through my body to my generations down will carry? What would they remember from me that hopefully won't be the trauma? It'll be, the good things. It'll be it'll be the gratitude, which is really rooted in Native cultures. It'll be these beautiful foods that were gifted to, settlers when they came over here. It will be all of those things, but let's just reframe, the concept, because Thanksgiving holiday is not going to go away. It's still going to be a national thing. I'm from Texas, and my family, voted for Trump. And so I'm always trying to like bridge that gap and trying to understand what would ever convince them, to really like open their eyes and just be more compassionate humans and not. So I think the reframing, kind of comes from that, all of those things. Like instead of reclaiming, like we're going to come and take this back from you. And it never really was ours anyways. Like we don't want this holiday, right? So we don't want it. Like we never made it up. So we, but from us, like, we carry these stories in our bodies, right? Like we carry these memories in our bodies. Even my older son is just like, we can't call it Thanksgiving. I'm like, we're not trying to celebrate it, he's just like, then we're not going to call it Thanksgiving because we're not going to celebrate it. And I'm like, that's true. It's just like another meal and we're having a meal. Okay. And then how do we talk about that? But now this year is kind of easier because we're not going anywhere. It's just us. So.
Right.
But if I was going to Texas, that would be a different story.
Well, this year is a good year. You can strategize. So the next time you do go to Texas, you're like, all right, we got a game plan. We're coming with this. And this is how we're going to reframe it for everybody back in Texas.
Exactly. We want to remember the truth, but the truth sucks. And we just, so it's like, okay, here's the truth. And also, like, we're tired of like telling everyone the truth. Like, here's the truth, but let's move on.
One of the things that you said that really stuck out to me was that you'll be an ancestor one day. Like, and I'm like, oh wow, like I'll be an ancestor. I have a son too, and just that concept. I mean, yeah, you're right. Like the history sucks. Like James Baldwin said, to be a black person, a semi-conscious black person in America, you're living in a constant state of rage. And really, anybody who's focusing on any of American history, whether it's the genocide, whether it's the enslavement, whatever it is, that's just a fact. But if we think about ourselves as ancestors in terms of the values and the culture, really the world that we're trying to pass on to our children and eventual grandchildren or whoever, that is really, really beautiful and empowering way to think about it. So that I really needed that really resonated with me because I often get bogged down in all the nonfiction that I read and listen to. So to think of it, to contextualize, to reframe even that history in terms of how I'm framing myself as an eventual ancestor. Thank you for that.
I mean, I tell myself that too. Like it's a very grounding thing.
Right. For sure. Vicki, I want to get your perspective as well. The history is uncomfortable, right? But as you talked about already, there's also beauty in the gratitude in and of itself. But I guess that conflict just kind of makes this whole thing uncomfortable, and people, especially white people, tend to really avoid the difficult conversations. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
I think it's because it's hard to face that these things were done, and that, for instance, this generation specifically didn't massacre that group of folks, but it's the same thing of benefiting from that massacre or benefiting from the lot. People don't want to hear it, and I understand it. I mean, I don't like to hear bad news or bad things about my family. I don't want to acknowledge it, but the way to acknowledge and to heal is to take that moment and say, this was done. And there's nothing you can say to change it. There's nothing you can do to heal that other than to acknowledge it and have it be said and look each other in the eye and accept it and be open on both sides. Like this should be a meeting on equal ground, and folks will probably yell at me for that, troll me for that, because it's never been equal for Native people. And it's like, I know, but let's rise above and set a new precedent and do this in the proper Indian way, which is that if we're speaking, if it's a talking, like some cultures call it a talking circle, but if you're having people over to speak, have the opportunity for everybody to speak and say their piece and meet each other. And even if you disagree, you can disagree at that time, but in a respectful and thoughtful way after you've listened to each other. And I think people will maybe start coming towards it if they're allowed the opportunity to sort of share their ambivalence, and share their confusion. And because when all is said and done, celebrating what we have, celebrating the people that are special to you, celebrating where you are in life is a wonderful thing. Quite honestly, don't wait for November to do it.
I pray that, people can start to see outside themselves.
Yeah.
Or outside of just themselves and the people that they love. I think that we need to listen.
And for Native people, I just say, I don't let the settler culture take from you the joy of celebrating each other. Choose any day you want to do it to celebrate your family and to celebrate gratitude. That whole idea of Thanksgiving, that name, people have tied so much anger to it and everything, but the whole expression of it underneath that gratitude is so important. It's so important to have the gratitude, but we know it is so ambivalent for Native people. It's really, really hard. Years ago, I did a play at the Smithsonian. I was in the harvest ceremony behind the Thanksgiving myth, and it talked about Tisquantum Squanto and how he met with the settlers who were raiding native food preserves in the winter because they were starving. And quite honestly, it's part of the Native culture that if you're super hungry and you ask, or at least for the Wampanoag culture, but generally from most Native people I've met, they have a similar thing. If you're going to pass by, you're not going to pass by hungry. We're not going to let you do that. But they took it instead. So Tisquantum was like, we'll help you. All you need to do is let us show you. And they started showing them how to cultivate things. And, there was a celebration, not on that date. And there was a celebration at their first harvest. They had invited them over. And then like the next year, most of that village was dead. And people don't want to hear that. They don't. And they've got to understand there's so much tied up within that. It's not just like, oh, you evil, evil people. It's like they were indoctrinated into this idea, that doctrine of discovery, that if you weren't Christian, you weren't human. So they were told that they were doing God's work by killing anybody who wasn't Christian. In that play, she listed not only the destruction of Tisquantum's village, but I think 3 different massacres that happened afterwards that were done on that day and celebrated as we eradicated the Indians from this territory. Let's celebrate.
Yeah.
It's weird. It's so weird. Like it is really an ambivalent and concerning holiday, but at the same time, I want that gratitude concept to permeate everything, because no, things are not perfect. They're not even slightly perfect, but wow, they can be really, really great,
No, I keep coming to this question of like, where do we go from here? We're here now, and we have to be committed to change together because we have to hold each other mutually responsible in order to grow.
We keep each other honest. We keep each other focused. We keep each other going forward. There's a weird element about that holiday too, because it's also an aspect of assimilation. And, everybody's celebrating something on that same date. And by doing it, you fit into the culture here, because I've talked to my friends who are from Vietnam and from Latin America, and they never had Thanksgiving before, and they're thrilled and excited about the opportunity to do something American, quintessentially American. And then I wonder too about, Black folks. Thanksgiving has been sort of indoctrinated into culture, but I also wonder, what about that ambivalence about the culture that came and imposed this?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, I think there's always that conflict between both Native peoples and Black people in terms of that ambivalence and that relationship with the dominant culture. Because at the end of the day, we want to feel connected to this country in some way. And for Black people, it's from the perspective of, we built this country and got nothing to show for it. And for Native people, it's like, hey, this is our land. So there is a sense of righteous ownership to part of the fabric of this country. And that extends to the holidays and the founding documents themselves, even though they didn't always apply to us equitably or in any real sense throughout history. So yeah, there's definitely some ambivalence there that I guess we all have to grapple with to an extent. And I don't expect this to be something that's agreed upon by everybody in these communities. I really think that each one of us, both, all of us here having this discussion right now and everybody listening, can have their own take on what this means to them and how they choose to go forward with celebrating Thanksgiving in this case or not. And how that sits with them and how they reconcile that ambivalence. And I guess kind of diving into one of the details here, food is obviously a huge part of Thanksgiving. So can you all speak a little bit about how you see food? I know one of the things you're working on is food sovereignty. So perhaps you could discuss that a little bit and then tell us a little bit about what that means and how that can factor into Thanksgiving.
The concept really of food sovereignty is you live as a land. You're living local. You're growing your own food. You're sustaining yourself. You don't need to depend on government subsidies or these foods that are coming in from all over the world, and that you can't own your own cattle because whatever beef company owns all the cattle, so really it's kind of like breaking down those structures. And for Native people, and I didn't grow up on a reservation, but for a lot of Native folks on reservations, they're sovereign nations, which haven't been honored at all. But for us as a Red House team, we really wanted to support any Native-owned businesses. There's a ton of them out there that we are putting together lists and posting on our social media too, to just kind of share. And I'm sure that we don't know them all. There's Shinnecock Nation is here in, the Hamptons, and which nobody even really realizes there's an entire reservation of Native American folks on Long Island. But Shinnecock Nation, they have coffee, they make coffee, and there's like a Paiute, winery. You can get cornmeal from the Navajo Nation. So we're putting together a really great list of Native businesses and farms and food supplier, businesses to support, which we think is really super, because we know that they're caring for the land and it's a sustainable practice too, which is also a good thing. And we should be going more local anyways, honestly.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a great concept and a great reminder. I know I'm fairly tied into the Black community as well, and there's a very strong push for that as well, especially with this is another thing to talk about, the whole Black Friday thing. That's coming up, and everybody, at least within the Black community, they're talking about, don't give Amazon any or more of your money. Like, support local businesses, Black businesses, whatever. And I think, supporting indigenous businesses and food sources should be part and parcel with that, because ultimately I think we all have a a different but similar relationship with the dominant culture of capitalism and all that. So I think, if we can support each other in solidarity, I think that's a beautiful thing. So it's encouraging to know that you all are doing the same thing in New York. And I'll need to search for the same type of thing in the DC area as well.
Absolutely. And our list is comprehensive across the United States, across, and North America distributors.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. That's good to know. I'll definitely check that list out. And Barrie, did you want to add to any of the discussion about the relationship between minority cultures and how, we have to fit ourselves into the dominant culture?
Yeah, I think that being of any culture in the United States is a constant negotiation of how much you want to buy into the mainstream and how much you want to hold on to something else. And I hate to even use that word, given like the way that it was just used in the election. I felt that tension as a child growing up in Virginia, being Jewish, not celebrating Christmas, and the pressures around, like, I wanted it so badly. It was something that my friends had. And then it's also tied up in this capitalist agenda, which is just part of this story that's the part that I don't buy into. But I think it's a question of how are people going to kind of come back into themselves, and whatever that may be, whatever that means, because this country is like divided in ways that it probably always has been, but is just more public now, given that there's a virus in our midst.
Right. Yeah. All the masks are falling. That's kind of cool, actually. I prefer it. I would rather know what lies beneath, I'd rather face it.
Same.
So looking forward, what are some of your thoughts on how we can approach the holiday and, be more mindful and cognizant of the history while potentially still participating in the holiday itself? Stina, do you have some thoughts on that?
We were just kind of kicking off this week on social media with thinking this through, our team. And we consist of folks from many different nations. The three things that we're trying to reframe is the truth, learning the truth and questioning, where these histories are coming from. And I think that's you don't have to read what we say, but it's just questioning who wrote this story. Do some work, check it out for yourself. You don't need to listen to me. I'm just a person who's doing that on my own, too. And then the second one is food sovereignty and thinking around your food, where it comes from, and through that, supporting Native businesses, meaning Native food businesses, any Native businesses, and also recognizing where these traditional foods come from, that are in the stories of this so-called Thanksgiving dinner. And then the third is gratitude. Gratitude is the root of many Native tribes. It's not a thing that you do on one day. It's what you do every morning. You're grateful for. You thank the tree for this medicine, or this, you thank the earth for this, the food that you're harvesting. You thank the water, we would not be anywhere without the water. And so that's just ingrained in our bodies, that we need to be grateful for these things, that, for the hawk, who are reminding us of the spirit world and where we and our ancestors, and those are all kind of pillars of the Thanksgiving, quote unquote, but let's just think them through from a Native perspective and not playing into this story.
Right. Yeah, that's great. Those are some good points. I appreciate that. Barrie, Vicki, Would you like to add anything?
I feel like, being in this community and not being Native, it has been just incredible learning at every turn, but there's also just been a lot of warmth. We don't know what we don't know. And as long as we don't approach the conversation like the colonizers before us, then we can reshape how we decide to connect around history, around shared traditions, as we move forward.
Continue to ask questions. That's all we can do. That's all we can do.
Red House Series, I sincerely appreciate you joining me on this podcast and welcoming me into this conversation that you all have been having. One thing that I would close out episodes with is a song I'm rocking to. But as the guest, I'm going to flip that over to you all. Whoever wants to, you can offer a song that you're rocking to right now. It's basically a song that, is motivating you in these times. You can please share the song and let us know why you are rocking to it right now.
One is like one of my favorite songs ever. And so Lyla June is an amazing poet and spoken word artist. And she's there's a song called All Nations Rise, Lyla June. It's all about like Indigenous people. We are the ancestors that our grandmothers were praying for.
Cool. All right. So the last two questions, and these are just questions for fun that I ask guests. The first question is, if you could have a superpower, what would it be?
A superpower is always such a super responsibility, but I've always felt like deep in my soul that I can fly. Or that maybe I knew the experience of flying in another way because I experienced like very vivid flying dreams. Seeing the world from that vantage would be a blessing. So to fly would be my superpower.
That's mine too. Hawks are like I just have a super connection to hawks, and they just like are soaring. They're not flapping their wings, they're just
gliding.
Feeling up there, yeah. And again, having that vantage point and just kind of like looking at, the bigger picture of things but yeah, definitely flying for sure.
So in the early stages of this show, I've had only a few guests on here now. Flying is the undefeated superpower of choice so far. The last kind of just close out question before the wrap is, what's the last book you read, and do you recommend it? Or you could just say the last book that you would recommend.
I am prepared with my books. Well, I have one that I'm reading right now, which is so good. And it's, and again, it's like, it is rooting and reminding us of our connection to the earth. And it's Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And it's beautiful. It's Indigenous wisdom, scientific knowledge, and the teachings of plants. So she's a scientist, she's Indigenous, but she combines that, the medicine with the science. And it's really beautiful. I would highly recommend. Yes.
That sounds good. I need to add that to my list.
Very cool.
Barrie, how about you?
I feel like a book that I read recently that I was really impacted by was They're There by Tommy Orange. I also really love anthology, and he takes these 12 stories of 12 people that intersect in these really interesting ways that generate like a whole new context around Oakland in a way I've never seen Oakland before, from like very diverse Native perspectives as well.
Cool. That's great. That's great. Appreciate that.
Wake up. All nations rise. Rise up, 'cause now's your time. We don't have to hide anymore, 'cause now's the time.
Well, that's our show. I really appreciate Red House Series for joining me on this. And remember, we can reframe Thanksgiving by using an Indigenous perspective on our truth, our food, and our gratitude. Y'all know y'all can get at me at RealDadult on Instagram. That's RealDadult. I look forward to any feedback you have on this or any prior episodes, and any ideas or suggestions you have on future episodes. With that, thank you again, Red House Series, for joining me on this. Be well, be safe, peace.